friends, welcome back to the Crooked Spoon. I'm so glad you're here. In today's video, I'm going to show you how a homemade pound cake can be light and fluffy. Follow along.
This is a great recipe to make ahead of time because pound cake actually gets better as it sits. Once your pound cake has cooled, if you wrap it in saran wrap for a day or two, it'll be so moist and delicious after that time. Some people like to grill it, but I love to eat it with a scoop of ice cream. The recipe starts with 227 grams of unsalted butter brought to room temperature. If you have the time, try to let that butter come to room temperature on its own. In a pinch, you can always microwave it at low power, but every product will come better if you let the butter come to room temperature on its own. This is a great time to talk about the concept of mise en place. When you're baking or cooking, the idea and concept of mise en place is to have all of your ingredients set and ready to go. I always encourage people, before you try a new recipe, to read it through to the very end. That's so that there's no unexpected surprises, such as, rest in refrigerator overnight. And also, it gives you an opportunity to really understand the timing of things. So if you gather all your ingredients and weigh and measure them ahead of time, you're ready to go in the moment when that recipe says to add things. It sets you up for success. So here I am prepping my sugar. And again, as always, my recipe will be in the show notes below, so you'll know exactly the correct amount, because baking is chemistry. It's an exact science. And if you want to have good results every time, please pay attention to your recipes. This pound cake recipe calls for a teaspoon of vanilla, and I have been using this brand, Nielsen Massey, lately. I'll link the product in the show notes below if you're interested in trying that particular brand. Now, my eggs have been sitting out also to get to room temperature. Unlike cream, when you're whipping cream for whipped cream, that needs to be ice cold, but eggs whip better at room temperature. They incorporate the air much better. And what's special about this pound cake recipe is we split the eggs. So we'll be incorporating the egg yolks with the butter and sugar, as a traditional recipe would call for. But later on in the recipe, we'll be whipping the egg whites and folding them into the batter. And this makes for a lovely texture pound cake in the end. If you've ever made homemade waffles, this is a technique that those recipes use as well. You separate your eggs and fold the whipped egg whites into the waffle batter right before you put it on your waffle iron. And for waffles, that makes for a very light and crispy waffle. Folding the egg whites into this recipe will make for a lighter, fluffier pound cake. We're using all-purpose flour here. I do like King Arthur brand. I try to stay consistent with my recipes. Again, it's all about getting the results that we expect. But feel free to use the flour that you prefer. I've had some milk sitting out also to reach room temperature. I do prefer to use whole milk when I'm baking. And the concept of getting milk to room temperature is so that the eggs and butter that have been up to room temperature and softened don't get cold by the addition of that milk. This recipe calls for table salt, which is a little different than most of my recipes, which call for kosher salt. So I always make a little note because I have mistakenly used kosher salt in the past. And you can tell just by the size of the salt particles of kosher salt versus table salt, You can't substitute one for the other in the exact amount. There's always conversion charts you can use, but this is important to use table salt, 1 teaspoon of table salt for this recipe. And then finally, I have a teaspoon and a half of baking powder. Again, that'll be our rising agent. But as we know, pound cake is usually more dense. It's not going to be as light and fluffy as like a golden yellow cake, but that separated eggs do help make a very great crumb texture in the end. So I'm adding my room temperature butter to my KitchenAid stand mixer bowl, making sure I get every last bit out for accuracy. I love these prep bowls and I love that scraper. I'll include these links in the video description below too. They just make life so much easier in the kitchen. Now I'm going to whip this butter by itself with my paddle attachment. And you can't overdo this stage. I want it to get light and fluffy. So we're talking 5 minutes minimum. If I have the time, I'll go up to 7 or 8 minutes. It's all about incorporating air and getting that butter nice and fluffy and light. Another part that helps when you're baking is to be efficient. If I have a minute because this butter is whipping, I am tidying up my workstation, right? I want to make sure that I have space and I have all of my ingredients ready to go for the next step. I am going to whisk my sugar. Since it's been sitting there, I want to make sure that there aren't any clumps. Moisture is the enemy of sugar, right? It'll clump if it's sitting out like that. And I'm going to add my sugar gradually, giving the butter a chance to incorporate it. And as you've seen in other videos, when you are using a stand mixer, especially with butter, we need to pause every now and then and scrape down the sides. It just won't mix fully with the ingredients all spread out. This is a 6-quart bowl, and I do like this capacity. I'm going to give the butter and sugar a chance to mix. Adding my last bit of sugar. And again, by adding, this is about 200 grams of sugar, this is taking me about 3 to 5 minutes. I'm taking my time to do it right because these are the steps that will give you a better product in the end. If you've ever made a homemade cake at home, you really can tell the difference between ones that have just been sort of mixed by hand or not mixed as long. So take your time with this and you'll love the results. Now I'm going to start incorporating the egg yolks. Remember, we separated them out. This is about 4 eggs. So 1 yolk at a time. Watching the batter to see when they're fully incorporated before I add the next. Let me know in the comments below what kind of mixer you like to use in your kitchen. I've had this KitchenAid for many, many years, and I'm so happy with the results. But I'd love to hear what you use in your kitchen. All right, we've got a great fluffy butter, sugar, and egg yolk mixture. I'm going to scrape down the sides and get it into the middle because this is the stage where we'll start incorporating the wet and dry ingredients in an alternating fashion. Let's get it all set up again. Paddle attachment on. And I've got all of my dry ingredients. I've got my all-purpose flour, my salt, and my baking powder. I'm going to put those all together, whisk them to combine. So those are my dry ingredients. And then I have my milk, 113 grams of room temperature milk, and I'm adding my vanilla to that container because this recipe calls for alternating the wet and dry ingredients. When you do these steps, whether it's for a crumb cake or a pound cake, you always start and end with the dry ingredients. So we think of fractions in this case. I'm going to visually divide my dry ingredients into 3 parts. So I'll be adding a third of my dry ingredients here. Let that slowly incorporate on the first speed level, the stir function. And then I'm going to visually add half of my liquid ingredients. So if you can think of that as being a third of the dry ingredients, half of the wet, then another third of the dry ingredients, and then the final half of the wet, and then the final third of the dry. If you want to take it a step further, you can divide your dry ingredients into quarters and your liquid ingredients into thirds. But the concept of thirds and halves is just enough to start and end on your dry ingredients. And at this stage, it's very important not to overmix. We don't want this pound cake to be tough from overmixing. We don't want that gluten to form in the flour. We want this to be tender and soft. So just mixing until moistened and incorporated is the way to go. So there was my final milk and vanilla stage. And I'll scrape the sides down a little bit before I incorporate my last third of my dry ingredients. Because I've separated out the egg whites, this batter is going to be very thick and very sticky. Don't be alarmed because it will all moisten and soften up once we've incorporated the whipped egg whites. So there's that final third of my dry ingredients, my flour, my baking powder, and my table salt. And I'm just stirring until combined. And at this point, I want to transfer it to a larger bowl because if you've ever incorporated egg whites into a recipe, see how thick that is? Very, very thick. If you've ever incorporated egg whites into a recipe, you really need space to fold them in. So I have a nice big bowl here, and I've put my batter. I'm going to put my batter into it. Tell me in the comments below what kind of mixing bowls you like to use. I do prefer stainless steel. I do have a nesting set of glass bowls as well. I can include those in the show notes. I do find stainless steel to be the best in any commercial kitchen or at my culinary school. So once I've gotten this thick batter into this large bowl, I'm going to set it aside because I do want to show you how I whip my egg whites. If I had a second bowl for my stand mixer, I could just set that up with the whisk attachment. But I'm going to use my hand mixer and get these going. We want to whip the egg whites until stiff peaks form. So very much like you're making a meringue. And depending on your weather, the day that you're in the kitchen, whether it's humid or dry, you will see different results in how long this takes. My kitchen is very dry right now. We are in the winter months where our radiator heat is on in our old Dutch colonial house, so my kitchen is cooler but very dry, and the egg whites will whip up to stiff peaks very quickly. See, now that's not quite stiff enough. They're sort of falling down in ribbons from the mixer. So I'm going to keep going. And then there we go. That's a nice stiff peak, very thick, not falling off the paddles. So unlike in a waffle batter that's very liquidy, folding in egg whites into this thick pound cake batter takes a little bit of muscle and patience. Let me show you the best technique. It's a mix of wanting to incorporate the egg whites, but also we don't want to deflate the egg whites. So if my bowl was a clock, I would be cutting down the middle from 12 to 6, and then I'd be scooping up from the 6 to 12 side of the clock. And then I rotate the bowl 90 degrees. And then once again, I would divide the middle to 12 to 6, and then I tend to scoop to the left. I suppose if you're left-handed, scooping to the right might be easier. But the trick here is to constantly rotate your bowl about 90 degrees so that when you're cutting down the middle from 12 to 6, it's always on a different plane of your bowl. And with time and practice, you'll be able to do that without even thinking of it. But once I've seen that my batter is nice and homogeneous, I'll line my 9x5 pan with these great liners that I found. I'll include those in the show notes. It makes life a little easier than having to pre-cut my parchment paper. And this way, the pound cake comes right out after baking, and I can put it in a bakery box for my customers. So pouring the batter in, again, it's still pretty thick, and I want to smooth that top so that when it bakes, it's nice and level. And I've been preheating my oven already to 350. And I'm going to make sure that my rack is in the middle. And this one loaf can take about 60 or 65 minutes. I do like to rotate it 180 degrees about halfway through the baking time. So I would set my timer for about 30 minutes or 25 minutes. I do have an electric oven, so things tend to cook more evenly. But if you have a gas oven, it's very important to rotate your baked goods in that oven and to ensure that they bake evenly. And I have found that sometimes because of the sugar content and the egg whites, the pound cake can brown pretty fast. So sometimes I do tent it with foil in the last 15 minutes of its baking time. So at about 45 minutes in, I'll tent it with a little foil, not cover it with foil. We want some airflow. So here we are after 60 or 65 minutes. I did a toothpick check to make sure that middle is cooked through. And there's our beautiful light pound cake.
Thanks so much for watching, friends. I'll see you in the next video.
If you enjoyed my video today, please like and subscribe. The Crooked Spoon.